On a silent night, lost secrets and forgotten fears come to light. Welcome. Today I'm taking you deep into a mystery that has remained unsolved for years. A brother's hope, a town's dark secrets, and something lurking in the forest. Are you ready for this story? Turn off the lights, put on your headphones, and let yourself sink into the suspense. Because this is only the beginning. Let's begin. Sometimes forgetting certain things is the best option, but humans tend to obsess over the very things they know they should forget. That's exactly what I did. 13 years ago, my little brother Ethan disappeared. He was only 10 years old at the time. Everyone in our small town searched for him, but no trace was ever found. When the search efforts failed, my parents had no choice but to accept that he was gone. But me, I never believed it. Even if Ethan was dead, I needed to know what had happened. Years passed and my family fell apart. I moved far away. But last week, a post I saw on Facebook called me back. Another child had gone missing. And it happened in the same place where Ethan disappeared, near the forest by the lake. The child's father had written in the post, "He's still here." That sentence unsettled me. Who was he, or what was he? When I arrived in town, I realized not much had changed. The air was still heavy and gloomy. People were still distant toward strangers. As I walked through the streets of my childhood, it felt like the shadows of the past were closing in on me. The old signs, the faded posters, they looked like ghosts of time itself. I stepped into the bar. I spotted Charlie immediately. Same table, same drink. His face had deep lines, the weight of the years evident. When his eyes met mine, he shook his head slightly. "I know why you came back," he said, taking a sip of his drink. "You won't find Ethan, man. He's long gone." "Charlie, don't lie to me. There's something here, and you know it." Charlie slowly lifted his head. "David, here's a friendly piece of advice. Don't stay too long. Digging up the past won't do you any good." But I wasn't leaving. If anything, I needed to stay longer. Someone was hiding something, and I wouldn't leave without finding out what it was. The next day, I stood at the entrance of the forest where Ethan had vanished. As I stepped inside, an eerie silence surrounded me. No birds, no wind, just a deep, suffocating stillness. I walked for hours. The shadows of the trees stretched long and menacing. Finally, I saw a cabin that hadn't been there before. Its wooden panels were rotting, its door barely hanging on its hinges. I pushed the door open. Inside, it was darker than I expected. The air was thick with dust, rust, and the stench of decayed wood. Something glimmered on the floor. I bent down and picked it up, a chain, and at the end of it, a bracelet. Ethan's bracelet. The moment I held it, I heard a soft crack behind me. I turned and saw a figure in the shadows, tall, thin, and faceless. My blood ran cold. I couldn't move. Then the thing tilted its head and whispered, "David." The voice, it sounded like Ethan's. I glanced behind me, searching for a way out. But the door had shut, and the thing was moving toward me, fast. I threw myself backward, my lungs burning as if filled with poison. That thing had reached the doorway, its whispers echoing in my skull. One more step, and it would have grabbed me. But suddenly a scream pierced the night from outside. The sound froze the creature for a moment. Seizing the chance, I lunged for the door, trying to force it open with all my strength. A second scream echoed from the darkness outside, shaking me to my core. I knew that voice. Was it Ethan? The thing recoiled, retreating into the shadows. But I knew it was still there, and I knew I might not make it out alive. As I stepped out of that cabin, I forced my trembling hands into my pockets. The scream that had echoed in my mind refused to leave me, haunting me like a ghost. I had heard that voice. It was Ethan's. I was sure of it. But how? Even after 13 years, I could never forget that voice. By the time I reached the edge of town, the darkness of the night had given way to the flickering glow of the pale street lights. My feet instinctively led me toward Charlie's bar. As I pushed the door open, the dim light inside momentarily blinded me. Charlie was behind the bar as always, but the moment he saw me, his expression changed. For a brief second, fear flickered across his face. He wasn't expecting to see me. "David, what the hell are you doing here?" I stepped closer, placing my hands on the bar. "I found something in the forest, Charlie. I went to that old cabin, and I found Ethan's bracelet there." Charlie's eyes widened, but he quickly composed himself. "Damn it, David. I told you not to go there. What do you think you're doing? You're hiding something, aren't you, Charlie? Tell me the truth." My voice wavered, and I waited for him to meet my eyes. But he avoided my gaze. Just then, the door swung open, and a tall man with a hard stare stepped inside. His warm leather jacket looked aged, and his face was set in a stern, unyielding expression. Charlie glanced at him and swallowed uncomfortably. The man's eyes scanned me before he walked straight toward us. "David, right?" he asked. I was caught off guard. "Yeah, who are you?" "My name's John Carter. I'm the sheriff of this town. I heard you went into the forest. What exactly were you looking for?" His piercing gaze bore into me, and I could tell he wasn't the type to be lied to. I held his stare. "That's where my brother disappeared. I know something is still wrong there. And now another child is missing. This can't be a coincidence." John turned to Charlie. "You didn't tell him anything, did you?" Charlie sighed and shook his head. "No, Sheriff, but he's determined to find out." The sheriff frowned and looked back at me. "Listen, kid, you have no idea what you're dealing with. Leave town. This place lives with its secrets, and those who dig too deep end up like the ones who vanished." At that moment, something clicked in my mind. The sheriff knew. I had always suspected the town was hiding something, but this was the first time I saw it being covered up so openly. "If you don't tell me the truth, I'll go back into that forest. Even if I have to go alone," I said firmly. John took a deep breath and nodded. "All right, David. Looks like you're just as stubborn as the others. In that case, you're going to learn everything. But first, we need to go somewhere." Charlie suddenly stepped in. "Don't do this, John. Taking him there is a bad idea." The sheriff hesitated for a moment, but then turned back to me. "Come with me, David, and be ready to never forget what you're about to see." At that moment, an eerie feeling crept over me. I was about to learn the truth, but I wished I didn't want to know. Sheriff Carter led me out of the bar. The night was cold, but the curiosity and fear rising within me were far more chilling than the air piercing my skin. Behind us, Charlie watched with uneasy eyes. There was a helplessness in his gaze, the look of a man who wanted to stop me, but couldn't. The sheriff guided me through the dark streets, heading toward a hill on the outskirts of town. He didn't speak the entire way. He just walked. The silence grew heavier with each step. When the town's lights faded behind us, I found myself standing before an old mansion, its wooden structure rotting away with time. This was the last place we investigated the week Ethan disappeared, the sheriff said, pausing, but we found nothing. Or at least, that's what we officially said. My heart pounded. What do you mean? The sheriff took a deep breath. That night we saw something here, David, something not human, and a week later the case was closed. His words echoed in my mind as he pushed the door open and stepped inside. The interior was abandoned, but scattered belongings suggested it had once been used. A dust-covered notebook lay on the table. The sheriff flipped through its pages and handed it to me. Read this. As I turned the pages, I saw shaky, uneven handwriting filling the journal. The entries grew more erratic, describing someone hiding here, seeing it. I hear voices, I see the shadow, it watches me. I want to run, but the door won't open. If someone reads this, it's still here, it's coming for me. The last word looked as if it had been written in blood. Fingerprints were frozen on the page. Then a creaking sound echoed from the attic above. The sheriff immediately drew his gun. I, however, was frozen in place. My eyes drifted upward, where the attic door swayed slightly in the dim light. "Stay behind me, David," the sheriff whispered. He took a step forward, then another. The floorboards groaned beneath his weight. The sounds from the attic fell silent for a moment, but then a scream, and it was Ethan's voice. The sheriff cursed and gripped his gun tighter. But I couldn't move. I knew that voice. It was my brother. I was sure of it. But how? Suddenly, the attic door swung wide open, and the darkness inside seemed to expand, reaching for us. And then it emerged from the shadows. Its form was indistinct. It resembled a human, but it was anything but. Long, thin arms nearly dragged across the floor. It had no face, yet I felt its eyes on me. My skin crawled. "David, get back," the sheriff shouted, raising his gun. But the thing didn't flinch. Instead, it whispered in a voice that sent ice through my veins, Ethan's voice. "You didn't forget me, did you?" My legs trembled. I inhaled sharply, but my lungs filled with a suffocating cold. This was impossible. Ethan was dead. But this voice, there was no mistake. It was him. The sheriff fired his gun, and the gunshot rang through the room. The bullet tore through the shadows, but the creature didn't recoil. Instead, it advanced slowly, its presence seeming to consume the dim light in the room. "Run, David," the sheriff yelled. But I couldn't move. The thing leaned closer, and a freezing hand touched my shoulder. I shut my eyes. This was the end. But then a figure appeared in the doorway. Charlie. He held an old oil lantern, and with a swift motion, he struck the flint, igniting the wick. For a brief moment, the shadows retreated, and the room flooded with flickering orange light. The thing shrieked. The sound was unnatural, like metal scraping against stone. Seizing the opportunity, the sheriff yanked me backward. Charlie threw the lantern onto the floor, and flames erupted across the room. "Get back," Charlie yelled. "It hates fire." As the flames spread, the shadows shrank into the corners of the room. The creature recoiled, as if trying to shield itself. When the fire encircled it, it let out a final, piercing scream, and then it vanished. Only the crackling of the fire remained. The sheriff was breathless. I was shaking uncontrollably. Charlie stepped closer, gripping my shoulders. "Now you know, David, your brother Ethan is still here, but we can't bring him back." My eyes burned with unshed tears. I didn't know what to do, but one thing was certain: this wasn't over. Not yet. As the flames slowly died down, the eerie silence that followed made my stomach churn. I could hear Charlie's heavy breathing, see Sheriff Carter still gripping his gun with trembling hands. But most importantly, that thing was gone, or at least it seemed that way. Just as a brief sense of relief washed over me, Charlie spoke in a grave tone. "David, if you think this is over, you're wrong. It's still here, and it can get even stronger." My throat was dry. "What do you mean?" I asked. "We saw it disappear." Sheriff Carter brushed the ash off his jacket and shook his head. "No, David, that entity has been here for years. At first, no one noticed, but when Ethan disappeared, that's when things changed. That's when it started getting stronger. And now we've realized something: it feeds on being forgotten. The more we forget it, the more powerful it becomes." Charlie's face twisted in grief. "That's why we never found Ethan. He might still exist here in some way, but as long as we keep forgetting him, this curse grows stronger." A chill ran down my spine. I clenched my fists. "So what now? Can we really destroy it?" Sheriff Carter was silent for a moment, then spoke. "There's only one way. If this entity gains strength from being forgotten, then remembering it, proving its existence, will weaken it. But," he hesitated, shaking his head, "it won't be easy, because this thing does not like to be remembered. It will fight back." Charlie narrowed his eyes and whispered, "Town records, the old archives. They must have burned most of them, but if anything remains, we might find the origins of this thing. If we find its roots, we can destroy it completely." I closed my eyes for a moment, thinking, this was going to be the biggest risk of my life, but for Ethan, for this town, I had to do it. "All right, where do we start?" Sheriff Carter's gaze darkened. "The town hall, the old archive room. But getting in won't be easy. That place was sealed off a long time ago, which means they were hiding something there." A few hours later, nearing midnight, we approached the abandoned town hall. No one had entered this building in years. The doors were rusted, the windows shattered, and the entire place looked like it had been left to rot. Charlie wedged a crowbar under the door, while the sheriff kept his gun ready. I took a deep breath and pushed against the door. It groaned loudly as it opened, releasing a wave of stale, moldy air. As we moved down the dim hallway, a few flickering overhead lights barely illuminated our path. After a few steps, Charlie stopped and swung his flashlight from side to side. "The archive room should be in the basement." The sheriff nodded. "We need to move fast. This place isn't safe." As we descended the stairs, an unsettling feeling crept over me. When my hand brushed against the railing, the coldness of the metal seeped into my bones. With every step, faint whispers echoed from the darkness below. I heard Ethan's voice, but there was something else. A second voice, twisted, malicious. When we pushed the basement door open, dust-covered files and documents lay scattered in towering piles. Some of the shelves had collapsed, spilling their contents across the floor. Charlie quickly began rummaging through the records. Sheriff Carter noticed an old safe leaning against the far wall. "There's something here," he said, trying to pry it open. Then a voice echoed through the room, a low, breathy whisper. "You shouldn't have come here." We turned sharply. A tall, dark figure emerged from the shadows. It was different from the entity we had encountered before. Larger, more terrifying. It had no face, yet the entire room seemed to be swallowed by its presence. "David!" Charlie shouted. "Now!" The sheriff yanked an old book from the safe. It was a journal stained with what looked like dried blood. Flipping through the pages, I saw the writings of past town residents' accounts of their battles against this thing. But the most important line was scrawled at the bottom. "Remember, say its name. The darkness grows when forgotten, but dies when recalled." Its name, but what was it? My head pounded. I thought of Ethan's disappearance, the stories we had heard as children. Then suddenly, it echoed in my mind. "Harrow!" I snapped my eyes open and faced the monstrous entity. "Harrow!" I shouted. The thing shrieked, "Dot, dot." The sound tore through my skull. The shadows recoiled, pulling away from the walls as if something had struck them. The sheriff and Charlie staggered back. I flipped through the journal and continued reading aloud. "Harrow, we remember you. You cannot hide. This town will not forget you." The creature convulsed as if its very existence was unraveling. The shadows that made up its body began to splinter, twisting and tearing apart. And then, silence. It was gone. I collapsed onto my knees, gasping for air. But I knew it was over. Charlie and Sheriff Carter rushed to my side. We were all breathless, shaking. "Is it over?" Charlie asked. I closed my eyes. The air was still. The weight that had loomed over this town for years had lifted, and in that moment I felt it. Ethan was finally at peace. The sheriff placed a hand on my shoulder. "We couldn't bring him back, David, but at least now he can rest." I nodded. "Yeah, and no one else will ever go missing again." As we stepped outside, the town's lights seemed to shine a little brighter. The night's silence was no longer terrifying. For the first time, I felt a sense of peace within me. Silent Night ended here, but we swore never to forget. And so the secrets hidden in the darkness of the night have come to light. But is it really over? Thank you, friends. I'm grateful that you joined me on this journey. The story ends here, but remember, some things only exist as long as they are remembered. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to subscribe and share your thoughts in the comments. See you in the next story. Don't get lost in the dark.